August 12, 1944. The air is thick with the chill of a world at war, yet inside the barracks, an unexpected warmth fills the room. German POWs, once captors on the battlefield, now sit side by side with British soldiers. They exchange hesitant glances as steaming cups of tea are passed around. It is an unspoken moment of incredulity. How could their enemies, who had endured unimaginable hardships themselves, now show such kindness? The soft murmur of conversations in unfamiliar languages fills the air as the prisoners slowly begin to realize just warmth, from the food on their plates to the genuine smiles of their captors. They've heard the stories of how POWs are treated in other nations' camps, but here, in this remote corner of Britain, the rules seem different. As they sit in silence, the German prisoners come to a stunning realization. In the heart of a war that has torn Europe apart, humanity still has a place, even in the most unlikely of places. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 saw Britain thrust into a battle for its very survival. Following Germany's invasion of Poland, Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany, marking the beginning of a long and brutal conflict. At the time, Britain was still reeling from the effects of World War I, and yet it quickly mobilized its forces, determined to hold firm against the Nazi juggernaut. For the British military, the early years of the war were marked by both setbacks and successes. The Battle of France in 1940 resulted in the rapid fall of the French government and the retreat of British forces to the shores of Dunkirk. Despite the evacuation of over 330,000 British and Allied troops, Britain stood alone against Germany. The Battle of Britain, in the summer of 1940, fought in the skies over southern England, marked a turning point as the Royal Air Force, with its Spitfires and Hurricanes, repelled the Luftwaffe's aerial assault, saving Britain from invasion. By the time the war expanded into Europe, Britain's military operations were increasingly dependent on the preservation of its supply lines across the Atlantic. And soon, the war was fought not only on the battlefields of Europe, but on the seas and skies. As the British Army fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually Western Europe, a significant number of German soldiers were captured and brought into British custody. The treatment of prisoners of war. In 1929, the Geneva Conventions had been signed, laying out the rights of POWs and the responsibilities of captors. While many nations, including Britain, adhered to these agreements, others, particularly Germany and the Soviet Union, flouted them. The Nazis were infamous for their brutal treatment of prisoners, especially in the East. Yet Britain, adhering to the conventions, treated captured German soldiers with a respect that, in the early stages of the war, set them apart from the Axis powers. At the start of the war, British POW camps were quickly established to house the tens of thousands of captured German soldiers. Unlike the horrors witnessed in German or Japanese prison camps, these British-run facilities were intended to follow the Geneva Guidelines as closely as possible. While the conditions were not luxurious, food was rationed, and the weather was often harsh, they were markedly more humane than what prisoners could expect in many other countries' camps. British officials, military and civilian alike, took pride in their adherence to the Geneva Conventions, believing that the way they treated prisoners reflected their nation's moral superiority. As the war dragged on, Britain found itself with a growing number of prisoners, many from the Western Front, North Africa, and the invasion of Italy. Despite the hardships of the war, Britain's treatment of its German POWs remained relatively civil. This was not out of sympathy for their cause, but out of a deep-rooted sense of duty and humanity, an enduring belief that decency should be maintained, even when fighting for survival. By 1944, the situation in Britain's POW camps had evolved considerably. Initially, the camps were often makeshift, hastily constructed to deal with the influx of prisoners. Many of these camps were located in the countryside, far from the bustling cities, and were surrounded by wire fences and watchtowers. While the camps were cold and basic, they were far from the squalid, inhumane conditions many POWs experienced in Axis camps. Over time, the British authorities adapted their approach to dealing with prisoners. British military leaders, especially those responsible for camp administration, began to embrace a more structured approach to the care of POWs. Rather than keeping prisoners in bare, utilitarian conditions, efforts were made to improve their living standards. POWs were provided with food rations that, while not extravagant, were nutritionally sufficient, and British civilians, who were often sympathetic to the prisoners' plight, contributed to their well-being by donating clothing, food, and even reading materials. What truly set British POW camps apart, however, was the unexpected kindness shown to the prisoners. British soldiers, many of whom had grown weary of the war's endless hardships, began to show compassion toward their captives. It was not uncommon for British soldiers to share their food with POWs, offer them small luxuries like cigarettes, or engage in friendly conversations. To the German soldiers, this was a complete surprise. They had come to expect nothing but cruelty from their captors, having witnessed the Nazi regime's treatment of prisoners in their own camps. Instead, they found warmth, both in the literal sense, as they were given blankets and warmer clothing, and in the emotional sense, as they were treated with basic human dignity. The British were not without their reasons for such behavior. On a practical level, they understood that the treatment of POWs was important for maintaining morale, both on the home front and within the ranks of the British military. But beyond this, it was rooted in Britain's sense of moral superiority over the Nazis. While Germany's propaganda depicted British prisoners as weak and disoriented, the reality was far different. British POWs captured by the Germans were often subjected to the harshest conditions. In contrast, the British maintained their sense of civility, even when faced with a brutal enemy. British propaganda took full advantage of the contrast between their treatment of prisoners and the Nazis' inhumane behavior. Posters and radio broadcasts often highlighted the kindness and humanity extended to German POWs, portraying Britain's stance as morally righteous in comparison to the cruel tactics employed by Nazi forces. These efforts not only bolstered British morale, but also served as a subtle critique of the Axis powers. Despite these efforts, the camps were not without their challenges. British officials had to balance the care of prisoners with the need to keep them under control. The camps were places of tension, and the British had to manage the complex dynamics of holding soldiers who, only months before, had been on the other side of the war. For the German POWs who arrived in Britain, the first days in the camps were a stark shock. These soldiers, accustomed to the brutal realities of Nazi propaganda and military dominance, found themselves caught in an emotional whirlwind. The German army had long boasted of its superiority, and the prisoners entering British camps were conditioned to expect severe, even sadistic. To them, surrendering was a shameful act, began to crumble under the weight of the Allied forces. Instead of harsh interrogations or brutal confinement, they were offered food, warmth, and even friendly exchanges. At first, the Germans were incredulous. How could the British, their sworn enemies, be so humane? It was an emotional strain that intensified as the POWs began to realize that they were not just being treated as enemies, but as human beings, deserving of the basic rights afforded by the Geneva Conventions. Slowly, the mental and emotional barriers began to soften. The bitterness and anger that had once driven them to fight were replaced by a sense of bewilderment and eventually gratitude. It was a silent acknowledgement that despite the war, there was still humanity to be found in the most unlikely of places. The British camps, though far from luxurious, were strategically designed to maintain order and discipline while adhering to the Geneva Conventions. British authorities took great care in organizing the camps, knowing that the management of POWs was just as crucial to the war effort as any battlefield engagement. While the camps were located far from the front lines, their locations were chosen with great tactical consideration. The prisoners, often from different parts of Germany, were grouped together based on their rank and function. This helped maintain some semblance of structure within the camps. Each POW camp was run by British officers and guards who had a clear understanding of the importance of maintaining discipline while also providing humane conditions. Food rations were distributed fairly, and efforts were made to ensure the POWs remained active and occupied. Work parties were established, and German POWs were assigned to various tasks, including agricultural labor or work in factories, contributing to Britain's war effort. These jobs provided a sense of purpose and were a stark contrast to the inhumane treatment many of the prisoners had experienced in German camps. Recreational activities were also encouraged. POWs were allowed to play sports, build gardens, and even engage in cultural exchanges with their British captors. This approach not only helped keep morale high among the prisoners, but also served to reinforce the British ethos of maintaining order with dignity. The care taken to avoid overcrowding and provide the prisoners with a degree of comfort was a testament to the strategic brilliance of British camp management. Managing thousands of prisoners in a war-torn country was no small feat, and the logistical challenges faced by the British in their handling of German POWs were immense. Yet, Britain's ability to efficiently organize and manage POW camps, despite the strain on resources, is a testament to the country's operational ingenuity. The logistics of transporting prisoners, ensuring their welfare, and integrating them into the workforce were tackled with an efficiency that allowed the British to adhere to the Geneva Conventions, while also maintaining a practical approach to wartime conditions. One of the most significant logistical operations was the transportation of POWs. As prisoners were captured on various battlefronts, from North Africa to Normandy, they had to be moved across vast distances to camps in Britain. This was no simple task. POWs had to be carefully managed in transit, with the risk of escape or unrest always a concern. Yet British authorities managed this feat with remarkable organization, ensuring the prisoners' safety while also keeping them under strict control. In the camps themselves, technology played a role in easing the hardships of both the POWs and their British captors. Simple innovations, such as makeshift heating systems in barracks, allowed the prisoners to survive harsh winters. British officers also utilized their prisoners for specific labor needs. German POWs were tasked with working on farms, in factories, and on infrastructure projects, contributing to the war effort in ways that, ironically, aligned with their own country's needs during wartime. This pragmatic approach ensured that, despite the adversities of war, British POW camps remained remarkably stable and humane compared to their counterparts elsewhere. The leadership within the British POW camps was marked by a commitment to human dignity, with camp commanders and British officers consistently upholding the Geneva Conventions. In contrast to the brutality seen in Axis POW camps, British leaders understood the psychological importance of maintaining order and discipline without resorting to cruelty. British officers saw their role not merely as guards, but as stewards of morale for both their own troops and the prisoners in their care. This sense of duty ensured that the POWs, while prisoners of war, on the strategic front, the treatment of POWs was also a powerful weapon in British propaganda. In the War of Ideas, Britain's adherence to the Geneva Conventions and its humane treatment of prisoners was a stark contrast to the treatment of British soldiers in German camps, and British officials made sure to highlight this. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and even wartime news reports reinforced the image of Britain as a force of moral righteousness, portraying the British as upholding the values of civilization even in the face of total war. This portrayal was more than just propaganda. It was a point of pride for the British. By treating their prisoners humanely, Britain not only adhered to international law, but also maintained a moral high ground that contrasted sharply with the Nazi regime's disregard for basic human rights. This shift in perspective, both inside the camps and on the home front, underscored the notion that Britain's strength was built not just on its military might, but on its values of decency and justice. For many of the German prisoners of war, the first few days in Britain's POW camps were filled with disbelief and confusion. These soldiers had been raised on a steady diet of Nazi propaganda. Now, as they stood behind barbed wire, surrounded by British soldiers, the prisoners would shuffle out of their barracks, their faces weary from the long journey and the psychological weight of captivity. In the cold, grey light of dawn, they would line up for roll call, their breaths visible in the crisp air. The guards were British soldiers, their uniforms pressed, their faces stern, but not cruel. No yelling, no punishment. Just a brisk, efficient routine. As the days passed, the prisoners began to adjust to this new life. What struck them most was the unexpected normalcy of it all. In contrast to the harsh conditions they had expected, there was order, cleanliness, and a surprising amount of food. For many POWs, this was more than they had received in their own army. The British did not treat them like animals, nor did they treat them like subhumans. They were prisoners, yes, but they were still men, men who deserved basic human dignity. During the day, the prisoners were put to work. In the early months, the work was simple, often on the farms or in the fields surrounding the camps. They helped harvest crops, repaired fences, and tended to livestock. The work was tiring, but not cruel. It was nothing compared to the forced labor they might have endured in German or Soviet camps. They were even allowed some time for recreation. A game of soccer in the afternoon, a chance to write letters to family and members back home, or a quiet moment spent reading the books that British civilians had sent them. As the days wore on, many prisoners began to change their perceptions. The surprise, at first, turned to confusion. How could their captors, the British, treat them with this level of kindness and respect? In conversations with their fellow prisoners, the Germans discussed their bewilderment. Some were resentful of the fact that the British, whom they had fought so fiercely against, were now their benefactors. Others, particularly those who had witnessed the brutality of the Eastern Front, quietly acknowledged the warmth they had found in Britain's POW camps. The greatest turning point came when a few of the German soldiers began to ask British guards simple questions. How did you manage to stay so civilized? Why are we being treated like this? The answers were simple. Adherence to the Geneva Conventions, a deep sense of decency, and the British belief that all men, even in wartime, deserved to be treated with respect. These answers, though seemingly straightforward, left the German soldiers stunned. They had been told that the British were cruel, that they were enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy Germany. Yet here they were, receiving tea and warmth in the dead of winter, and most surprising of all, they were not being coerced into forced labor or punished for minor infractions. By the end of their first few weeks in the camp, the German POWs had experienced an emotional shift. They began to realize that their captors were, in many ways, more humane than they had imagined. The British soldiers were not just treating them as prisoners, they were treating them as human beings. War continued. The relationship between British soldiers and German POWs in the camps began to shift, subtly but profoundly. What had initially been a strictly hierarchical interaction, the captors and the captured, began to evolve into something more complex. The shared experiences, the small moments of kindness, and the quiet conversations between soldiers and prisoners began to chip away at the walls that had separated them. One of the most striking features of life in the POW camps was the growing cultural exchange. British soldiers, who had grown weary of the war and the unending battle, found a strange camaraderie with their prisoners. It wasn't just about the mundane tasks of camp life, the work, the food, the routines. It was about the unspoken connections that developed as POWs and captors began to see each other not as enemies, but as men caught in the same terrible conflict. In return, some German soldiers, fluent in their own language, would offer lessons in German. The linguistic barriers, once so vast, slowly began to crumble. The shared language allowed for more in-depth conversations. POWs would ask questions about British life, about their homes, and about what life was like before the war. British soldiers, in turn, would ask the Germans about life in Germany, about the war, and about what had driven them to fight. There was even a sort of informal exchange of cultural ideas. German POWs, many of whom were trained musicians or artists, would give small performances for the British Guards, who were eager to see something that wasn't war-related. Music, art, and small gifts were exchanged between the prisoners and the British. It was not the grand gestures of friendship, but it was a quiet, meaningful exchange that symbolized the profound shift taking place within the walls of the camp. For the POWs, these small acts of kindness, these moments of shared humanity, were a revelation. For many of the German POWs, it was a disorienting shift in perspective. Now, in a foreign land, stripped of their power, they were forced to confront the notion that the British were not their enemies because they had been born on a different soil. They were just men, fighting for their country, much like themselves. These exchanges, though small and personal, were a turning point in the emotional journey of the POWs. They began to see the British as more than just the enemy. They were a symbol of something larger, a belief in humanity, decency, and dignity in a world consumed by violence. This gradual shift would have a lasting effect, not just on the POWs, but on the relationship between former enemies in the years to come. The end of the war in 1945 marked the beginning of a new chapter for the German POWs held in British camps. After years of captivity, many were finally released and sent home to a Germany that had been shattered by defeat. For many of the former prisoners, the transition from captivity to freedom was a complicated and emotional experience. They had spent years behind barbed wire, enduring the hardships of war and the constant pressure of military life. But now they were free to return to their homes, their families, and their former lives. However, the return was not without its challenges. Germany, like the rest of Europe, was in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble, families had been torn apart, and the psychological scars of the war were deep. For many of the former POWs, returning home meant confronting not only the physical destruction of their country, but also the psychological trauma of their experiences in captivity. From their homes for years, and some had witnessed unimaginable horrors on the Eastern Front. Now, as they returned to a country struggling to rebuild, they found themselves caught between the guilt of their role in the war. For many former POWs, the memory of their time in Britain was bittersweet. Despite the hardships, their time in British camps was often remembered as a strange respite from the brutalities they had experienced elsewhere. They had been treated with a level of humanity and respect that was in stark contrast to what they had been accustomed to under Nazi rule. The warmth shown to them by the British soldiers and civilians had left an indelible mark on their hearts and minds. Many POWs left Britain with mixed feelings, grateful for the kindness they had received, yet carrying the weight of their involvement in a war that had caused so much devastation. Reintegration into post-war Germany was not easy. Many former POWs struggled to reconcile their experiences in Britain with the harsh realities of life in a defeated nation. The propaganda that had demonized the Allies for years had painted an image of Britain as a heartless enemy. Yet the reality was far different. Many former POWs found themselves at odds with the official narrative promoted by the Nazi regime. They began to question the ideology that had led them to war, and were forced to confront the moral complexities of their actions during the conflict. Yet, as Germany slowly rebuilt, these former prisoners of war found their voices. They spoke of the humane treatment they received in British camps, often in stark contrast to the stories of brutality they had heard about Allied treatment of German soldiers. Their accounts contributed to the broader post-war narrative of reconciliation between former enemies. For many, the kindness shown by the British was not just a passing memory, but a lasting influence that helped shape their post-war lives and views on the world. The legacy of Britain's treatment of German POWs during World War II had far-reaching implications, both in terms of its impact on international law and its contribution to post-war reconciliation. In a world torn apart by conflict, Britain's adherence to the Geneva Conventions and its commitment to humane treatment set an example that influenced the treatment of prisoners worldwide. Britain's policy of kindness and respect toward POWs became a point of pride in the years after the war. In contrast to the brutal treatment of prisoners in other nations' camps, Britain's efforts were seen as a moral high ground. The British believed that how they treated prisoners reflected their values, and this belief was reinforced by the positive reports from former POWs, who often spoke highly of the respect and humanity they had received during their captivity. The humane treatment of prisoners also had significant diplomatic implications in the years following the war. As Britain worked to rebuild its relationship with Germany, former POWs became part of the process of reconciliation. Many of them, having experienced the kindness of their British captors, became advocates for a more compassionate approach to international relations. This helped pave the way for a lasting peace between former enemies, as shared experiences of humanity and kindness created a foundation for mutual understanding and cooperation. Moreover, Britain's treatment of POWs had a profound impact on the development of international law regarding prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions, though signed long before World War II, had not always been strictly adhered to. But the contrast between Britain's treatment of POWs and the horrors witnessed in Nazi camps became a powerful argument for the importance of these legal frameworks. The post-war years saw a renewed focus on the treatment of prisoners, and the stories of British POW camps were often cited as examples of how the Geneva Conventions should be followed. In the years that followed, Britain's treatment of POWs became a symbol of its moral superiority over the Nazi regime. The British military, civilians, and government were lauded for adhering to principles of decency and humanity in a time of total war. Their example resonated in post-war Europe, where the focus shifted toward rebuilding and reconciliation rather than punishment and revenge. The humane treatment of POWs was not just a temporary act of kindness. There is still room for compassion and decency. The treatment of German POWs in British camps, in the broader context of the war, represented not just a break from the horrors of war, but also the beginning of a long journey toward peace. It set a precedent that would influence the treatment of prisoners in future conflicts and helped lay the groundwork for a post-war order built on reconciliation and international cooperation. The story of British hospitality to German POWs during World War II is a profound testament to the resilience of humanity, even in the darkest of times. Amidst the brutality of war, when entire nations were torn apart by violence and hatred, Britain chose a path of compassion. For the German soldiers who found themselves in British camps, the warmth and kindness extended to them by their captors was an unexpected reprieve, an act of humanity that went against the tide of the cruelty they had experienced or perpetrated. This surprising hospitality was not a sign of weakness, but of moral strength. Britain, though deeply entrenched in the fight for survival, recognized the value of maintaining decency and dignity, even in captivity. This commitment to the Geneva Conventions and the humane treatment of POWs became an enduring symbol of British values and its moral stance, in contrast to the totalitarian cruelty of Nazi Germany. The impact of this treatment reverberated long after the war. Former German POWs, many of whom returned home disillusioned by the war, spoke of the kindness they had received in British camps. Their accounts of humanity, compassion, and respect helped shape post-war relations, paving the way for reconciliation. Through small acts of kindness, Britain not only preserved its moral integrity, but also helped sow the seeds for future peace between former enemies. In a world that had been ravaged by conflict, the British treatment of POWs is a powerful reminder that even in the most trying of circumstances, the human spirit can rise above hatred. It proves that, while nations may be at war, the individual acts of decency and empathy can still endure, leaving a legacy of compassion that transcends borders, ideology, and time.